Hello and welcome back to the Single Malt Frontier, where we explore the edge of innovation in American single malt whiskey. Here on the show, we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. Usually we talk about whiskey, but the best thing about whiskey is the conversations that we get to have along the way, and we get to talking about a little bit of everything. I'm your host, Doug, or as I'm known around the internet, Demi Tastes. I'm joined today, as usual, by my co-host, Phil from the Rangers Respite. And our guests today, coming back for the second time, are Nora and Adam from Lost Lantern. And we are today going to talk about the fall collection, fall, not winter, right? Fall collection, 10-year, essentially 10-year or essentially 10-year whiskeys. We have four of them. So we have Tom's Foolery, Ohio Straight Bourbon Whiskey, which is 10 years old. California Spirit Works California Straight Rye Whiskey, 10 years old. New York Distilling Company, New York Straight Rye Whiskey, 10 years old. And lastly, the Westland Distillery Peated American Single Malt at 9.99 years old, just one day short of 10 years old. And we'll talk about why that is in a moment. But before we get onto those whiskeys, welcome back, Adam and Nora. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having us. It's fun to be back talking about some new whiskey.
Yep, enjoying a nice blizzard in Vermont. So fun to be back. And if we end up talking really fast, that's probably why.
Okay. Fair enough. And so you're at the Vermont tasting room right now. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So we'll try not to keep you too long so you don't get caught out in the blizzard. And it is, it's not quite 5 p.m. for you yet. So hopefully we won't be sending you home too late. But thanks very much for joining us this December. We're really excited to talk about these whiskeys. So first, I just wanted to ask, why 10 years, a whole set of 10 years whiskey at this point in time? Any particular reason, or did it just kind of come together like that?
Yeah, so I know obviously a lot of this we talked about on the last episode, but we're an independent bottler. We source whiskey from all across the country with full transparency. And a lot of what we try to do this year, whenever we put out whiskey, is not just put out whiskey and say, here's some great whiskey that we found, but put out whiskey here's some great whiskey that we found that has some kind of a story to tell or a unifying narrative. And one thing that we've both heard for many, many years, since even before we started Lost Lantern, is that all whiskey from newer distilleries or all craft whiskey is young. And that is something that has been a perennial refrain for many, many years. And we've seen that's not nearly as true as it used to be, to the extent that it was ever really true at all. There's more and more whiskey from newer distilleries out there that has pretty serious age statements about it. So we asked ourselves, okay, what if we really push that and say, what is there that has a double-digit age statement? And wanted to find a collection of whiskeys, not just that were 10 years old, but that were 10 years old and hopefully really good, that can show that there's whiskey out there that can compete with more traditional age statements from places that wouldn't have been possible just a few years ago.
And it's worth noting, I mean, we like to say we're age agnostic. So it's really about, is the whiskey good? Does it taste mature to us? We've released 1-year-old whiskey. Now we've released 10-year-old whiskey. But for us, the really cool, compelling thing about talking about age is that it's now just another tool in the toolbox for a distillery. Some distilleries don't want 10-year-old whiskey. Some distilleries think they want 20-year whiskey eventually. Part of that is just deciding what aspects of the whiskey you want to bring out. Do you want more oak? Do you want more grain? All of that goes into the equation, and age is just one of the many things. There's often so much focus on age, and the irony is we're doing a 10-year-old collection and saying, hey, this is really great, but also like it's not even really the point here. And it's also a great opportunity to taste whiskey from these distilleries that haven't necessarily put out 10-year. 2 of them have already, but 2 of them, this is the oldest whiskey that they've ever had out in the world. And so it's a great opportunity to showcase a distillery in a way that they might not showcase themselves.
And the last thing we'll say about the theme of the collection is that we think this is a glimpse at the future of American whiskey. There are still very few newer distilleries that have 10-year-old whiskey. There are more than just these 4, but these 4 were the ones that we liked the best and were able to get our hands on. But there are going to be more and more places that have mature whiskey in the years ahead, so that an age statement comparable with Kentucky will no longer be unusual within a couple of years, at least where maybe not for the 20-year-old stuff.
And maybe not for Texas.
Yeah.
But for cooler climate distilleries where they can actually get to an age that people want to drink that whiskey, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so I'd say let's pour the Tom's Foolery and sort of get started down the line. And we'll ask a couple more questions as we go. So we're going to keep self-promotion short today because we did self-promotion last week. But I will just say I am pouring the first sample into my Single Malt Frontier Glencairn, which we now have official merch, and you can find out more about this. Here, let me just make that so you can actually see it. So you can see that logo. That's the same as our McCarthy's Barrel Pick sticker. You can find details about that in the description. So with no further ado, let us get back to tasting this. So,
Yeah.
Foolery, what should we know about this? I can tell you right away. I know this is already sold out. This has a wonderful, dedicated following. It actually sold out, I think, within 24 hours of going to the public.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are 3 bottles still yet to be released in Massachusetts, but I don't think they'll last long. Our distributor called me today and said they're shipping them to retailers tomorrow. So if you're a lucky person and live in Massachusetts, there are 3 bottles left. You can talk
Okay,
about it.
and tomorrow is Tuesday, which will actually be a couple of days before we release this recording. So
yeah,
So
thank you.
Possibly gone by now. But yeah, Tom's Foolery is probably the smallest distillery that we've ever worked with. We've worked with craft distilleries all over the country, ranging from places that make 20 to 50 barrels a year to places that make 10,000, which is still a fraction of the size of the big players. But Tom's Foolery is really a 2-person operation. The aforementioned Tom Herbrook and his wife Leanne, who are in the snow belt off of Lake Erie near Cleveland. It's a very, very snowy part of the country. It's only one state north of Kentucky, but it's much, much cooler. And we think of Tom's Foolery as sort of the American version of a French farmhouse distillery, where they use some grain that they grew themselves. They use some grain that they got from elsewhere. They make whiskey, they age it. And part of it is just because they really like doing it. And then some of it ends up getting to be 10 years old. They release primarily in Ohio and don't have that much of a national brand recognition beyond that, although they did to some extent a number of years ago, because they made a big splash when they came out with one of the very first bottled to bond whiskeys that was not from Kentucky or Tennessee since Prohibition. So they've been one of our regular partners for about a year and a half now. We've done a number of barrels from them, all of which have been the oldest whiskeys of that style we've ever released. We did our first 8-year-old from them, our first 9-year-old, and now our first 10-year-old. And it is actually the oldest of this collection.
But not the oldest they've ever put out. They've put out some of the oldest whiskey of any of our partners.
okay, awesome. So I'll just full disclosure, I don't drink a lot of bourbon or rye for that matter, but I do occasionally do some tasting notes and do a review just so that I can have that context. And so this might be totally off base, and I'm willing to flame me in the comments if you must, but we must know our limitations. What I had wrote about this whiskey was that I felt like this is, so first of all, oak is nicely balanced. So for me, that's like a nice relief for a 10-year. Normally I sort of expect a 10-year bourbon to be a little bit too oaky for me personally. But I noted that this is like different from the classic bourbon as well. There's like some herbal notes in here, and it's relatively dry, I think, considering like 10 years, you'd expect a lot of oak influence. And the note that I put here was that I felt like this might be a bourbon for rye drinkers. And I feel like that tracks with the people that I know who are fans of this distillery. They're a mix of, they drink a mix of bourbon and rye. So I wonder if I'm not totally off base about that.
That makes sense to me, because I totally agree that it is not as oaky as you would expect for a 10-year-old Kentucky bourbon. And that's why we always talk about climate and where something comes from a lot, because like you would never say like that a 10-year-old Scotch you would not expect that to be too oaky because the climate is so much cooler there. But even
in new barrels, I feel like Tom's Foolery over and over again, we always talk about how they're a great example of what bourbon and rye can look like when there isn't a huge amount of oak influence because it's so cold there. Cool climate bourbon and rye can age longer without becoming overly extracted, and it just gives you a different perspective. They also have a house style, which yes, is a little bit more kind of herbaceous, a little bit more floral, and so that balances well with the fact that there's less oak because you still get that, but the climate does so much of that holding the oak back.
Yeah. And as Nora said, even though this particular cask is sold out, Tom's Foolery regularly puts out relatively old age statement whiskey from like 8 to 12-year-old. And some of it's only available in Ohio. Some of it occasionally makes it to some of the flagship whiskey stores around the country, like K&L in California.
And Steelbox. Steelbox actually has a private barrel of our Tom's Foolery stuff as well. It's rye though, not bourbon. Yeah.
So it's this cask is gone, but Tom's Foolery is not in itself unattainable. So definitely worth seeking out.
Okay, awesome. So for people who don't know much about Tom's Foolery, like myself, frankly, could you tell us a bit about their production style besides the aging climate?
Yep. So they are very old school in their methods. It's always been pot still distillation. These days they use a French, like a cognac pot still. When these were made, it was a different kind of pot still. And it's a very hands-on fermentation, open fermenters in oak fermentation. And you don't see that very much. There are places like Leopold Brothers that do it on a slightly bigger scale, but like they're basically like literally working out of a barn that is usually open to the air. And I think that is a part of the choice that they've made, is that this is the way that whiskey used to be made, where it has full interaction with the environment around it at every step of the process, not just in the warehouse, but also in the production facility. And that they're committed to long fermentation times and long aging times, as we've seen with this.
So it sounds like we'll get a sense of terroir from this whiskey, such as it is. Yeah.
At least what climate does in maturation. Whether or not the terroir of the grain comes out is up for debate. But yes, you see the climate in this. Sure. Taste the climate, if you will.
Yeah. I think the Midwest might be the mildest aging climate in the United States. I mean, the Pacific Northwest, you could argue maybe Seattle is pretty mild as well. But Oregon, for example, gets really hot. Do you find that's true? You did the Midwest series this past summer. So you've had some experience with sort of seeing how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, we love Midwest whiskey. I think that there is a creaminess that you get from the Midwest that you don't get from anywhere else. It's a combination of the fact that I think it never gets so insanely hot, and also the fact that it's cold enough that the whiskey goes to sleep. Like, it's very cold in a lot of these places for a long time, and I suspect that there is a process that is happening there. There's something, like, I know that from a chemical perspective, it's not doing oak extraction, but there is a consistent creaminess to the palate of whiskey that is from that region that it makes me think that it has to be something going on in that. And we love it. And this is not a rye, but I think it makes really mellow rye that I personally love. I am less partial to a white pepper note in rye that I find comes from warmer climates. Cooler climates have less of that. And so I really gravitate towards a Midwest rye for that reason.
Cool. And speaking of rye, and I'm going to let Phil ask some questions because he's the rye guy. Let us move on to our second sample. So up next, we have the Spiritworks California Straight Rye. So we're going to a completely different aging climate.
Oh, yes.
Also 10 years old. So coastal, warmer, quite a lot of different changes in barometric pressure as well, right? Like it's just kind of a wild aging environment. So yeah, let's get this in the glass.
And the proof is a stone's throw from Hazmat.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is
a
very substantial jump in proof from the Tom's Foolery, which is on the mellow side, at least by cast strength standards, or at least by our standards, to this, which, as Phil said, is near Hazmat.
Which is much stronger than Spiritworks has generally put out. And this is also much older than what they have put out.
Yeah, this is their first 10-year-old rye. And do you want to talk about Spiritworks a little bit in their story?
You do it. You're better at I like to talk about climate and stuff. You're better at talking about the distilleries. Let's just roll with that.
So they are a wife and husband distillery in Sonoma wine country, just adjacent to all of the great wineries of California, or many of them. And I think it's fascinating to have a distillery in wine country, not because of any direct influence on what how the whiskey turns out, but just the cultural influence you get from an area where wine is the dominant aspect of the culture, and flavor and taste are so important. And they've always been about creating whiskey that reflects the bounty of California. They tend to use a lot of organic grains. These days, I believe they're all organic. At the time this was made 10 years ago, they could not get all organic grains that were grown in California. It's easier now because there's been so much growth in that. But for them, it's the idea is, like a lot of places we work with, to make a whiskey that reflects where they are. It doesn't taste like Kentucky rye because it's from a totally different climate. It's warm, it's coastal, it has the maritime winds that come over Sonoma. They're also one of the only female-led distilling teams in the country, which is Ashby, one of the founders, is the head of production, and most of the distillers there have been women. And I think that's just something that you don't see very much in an industry that is still very male-driven.
So I'm particularly a large fan of rye. It is what I would prefer to drink. And I haven't had any ryes from California before this. It has a sort of interesting, probably from the oak, a very dark, rich caramel that sort of tempers the like herbal and the like little bit of like cracked black pepper and aniseed that I get on the edges of the palate.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. It's fun because we have two ryes, and I think of this as the rye drinker's rye.
And I think of the other one as the rye drinker's rye. So that will be fun to see where we land.
And we have a totally different rye drinker in mind. That's the problem.
Okay, so I guess we'll have to see what Phil thinks, because I wrote in my review of this one that I felt this was the rye drinker's rye.
Yes, Phil, don't let me down.
2 votes for that. So Phil,
over.
do you want to even the count, or do you want to throw in with the majority?
I haven't tried the other one yet. I go.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. That's completely fair. So we'll come back to that question. Absolutely. So I feel like it's. Sorry, go ahead.
I get a salted caramel like around the edges of the tongue. It's surprisingly sweet.
Yeah.
I think of their whiskey as a more grain forward side. Like, they are trying to showcase the grain in a way that you see now with these newer distilleries, but the 10 years allows you to get the best of both worlds. You get both that full kind of herbaceousness, you get the pepperiness of the rye, like the spikiness that you sometimes, not in a bad way, but just like rye to me is always spiky. But you also get that warm hug of the oak
and the grassiness too.
So this is my favorite Spirit Works that we put out.
That's the third single cast that we've done from them. They were our second ever rye partner, and we haven't done anything from them since before this, since 2022. So it's nice to revisit with something that's a much older age statement. And we worked with them to do a 10-year when told them, like, we hunted it down
collection.
Specifically for this collection, which was a fun thing to do, to really show off what they're doing, because I think they're not that well known outside of California. And Doug, to your point about not having had a California rye before, I think
That was Phil.
Oh,
Yeah.
Phil,
Yeah,
sorry.
come on, that was Phil. That was Phil.
I'm so embarrassed. California is a huge state, so it's one of the few states that we're looking at that we think will eventually develop into multiple whiskey regions, because the climate in different parts are so different. We think it'll happen in Texas as well. But this is from Sonoma, relatively close to the coast. We've also done rye from Corbin Cache in California's Central Valley, which is, both are pretty warm. Corbin Cache is super hot. You were there in November, and it was pretty spicy. And that's an area that has very, very minimal maritime influence. So quite different. And then there are also distilleries in the mountains in California near Tahoe, and places that are right on the coast. And we think that's fascinating to explore how that develops over time.
Yeah, like our friends at Hinter House.
Yeah.
Sort of up there near Tahoe, about an hour away, I think.
Exactly who I had in mind when I said that.
Yeah. Speaking of which, do you think you'll be doing any collaborations with them anytime soon?
Well, our rule is always that we can only work with distilleries that we visited in person, and I have not had a chance to make it out there yet. You're more likely to than me because you've been out to California a lot this year. So it's sometimes hard to get back to an area that we visited a lot when there's a newer distillery that we want to get to. But
Fair.
I think it'd be pretty rough to have to go to the California mountains. Poor us. So I think we could probably make it happen sometime.
Yeah.
Well, just my own little road trip plan, and maybe use this for inspiration if you like, is to visit Minden Mill and then make the drive to Hinter House.
Nice.
So even though Minden Mill's in Nevada, it's basically South Lake Tahoe, so pretty close.
Yeah. We've done the other way.
Yeah,
Going around north through the Pacific Northwest, and then
Or just the Sacramento to
Reno.
Reno.
And then down to
because for Frey Ranch as well as Minden Mill. Yeah.
and if you're going out there, you should definitely go to Frey Ranch as well. And we have not been to Minden Mill, but we did go to it when it was Bentley Heritage. It's prior name, so before the transition. But it is quite a cool distillery, so definitely worth a visit.
It's an interesting philosophical question. Do you then consider yourselves to have visited the distillery, given that it's under a new name and new ownership?
I kind of haven't decided.
Okay.
It helps that we know Joe. So Joe O'Sullivan, who used to be, you guys know this, but I don't know that everyone does, but used to be at Hood River and McCarthy's.
Yeah.
So we also know him very well.
Yeah,
and we
trust him. But there's a part of me that's curious, like, what are you doing with this massive collection of whiskey that you've suddenly have walked into, and what are you doing with it? And part of me just wants to go out there again and revisit, but I don't know if we would necessarily have to, but I think we probably want to.
If you want an excuse to go out there, you'll have to go out there.
I'm just dying for another excuse to go to Northern Nevada and hit up State Line and the penny slots.
So I will just say, I hope our audience knows about Joseph O'Sullivan, because that is how we initially got started on our McCarthy's barrel pick. This is still available for now. There's a few dozen bottles left, as far as we know. So that sold very well. You might still be able to get one for Christmas. And that, again, is the logo on this Glencairn is the same as the sticker on that bottle. Okay, so back on the Spirit Works, though. I want to give my tasting notes, and then I have one question before we move on. So when I was thinking rye drinkers rye, I was looking for those notes like pepper, which everybody's mentioned, eucalyptus, which I get from this as well. And there's also this rich oolong tea quality to it, which I don't associate that with bourbon typically. I don't know if that's a typical rye note, but that feels rye to me. And let's see, what else did I get? Oh, we were talking about grassy. So is anyone familiar with that? Like if you get like boba tea, one of the things you can add into it is this grass jelly.
No.
Nope.
We live in Vermont.
I don't.
Fair enough.
Is the boba tea in Vermont? There must be somewhere.
Yes, but not
So there's this
cool editions like that.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So there's this like herbal infused jelly they call grass jelly that they use as a dessert in Asian cuisine, and you can get that in boba tea. So next time you're in the Pacific Northwest, check out a boba tea shop and get the grass jelly.
Noted, because I do like boba tea. So
Missed that from our Brooklyn days.
Yeah.
Or possibly any like major city in Texas. There's probably a lot of places you can get boba tea.
I did actually get some when I was in Seattle most recently, but now I know that I have to add the grass.
Missed out on the grass jelly.
Also check out Hot Pot, because they also have this like jelly dessert after Hot Pot. Same deal. They put the grass jelly and like brown sugar syrup on it.
Noted.
Yeah, cool stuff. Okay. So we will have to wait to see whether Phil thinks that this is Rye Drinkers Rye. But one last question before we move on. So you mentioned this is the oldest whiskey that Spirit Works has released. And you did call out there's reasons for the 9.99 years on the Westland, which is that they haven't released a 10-year yet. So I'm wondering what's different in the calculus that you wanted to release a 10-year California rye and call it a 10-year when it's their oldest whiskey to date.
The big difference there is we sourced this barrel for this collection. The Westland we already had. Okay. So they sold us, and we selected under the 10-year collection focus. So they knew going into it what it is there for.
Yeah.
And so by contrast,
we bought the Westland when it was probably like
8.
7.5 to 8 years old and have been aging it since then. So a solid portion of the aging was in Vermont and out of their hands. So it felt a little different than something that was sort of specifically to show, like, here is your 10-year-old California whiskey.
Yes.
Got you. And it's a different aging climate. Totally makes sense. Okay, we'll come back to that. So let us move on to our next rye in the collection. The New York Distilling Company, New York Straight Rye Whiskey, 10 years old. ABV 66.9. So not quite as spicy as the previous one. Although I will say, I had no idea it was anywhere close to hazmat, the California spirit
It's
whiskey.
dangerous. That's the other thing about 10 years. I think that it really, if it's done right, it mellows the ABV. It doesn't come off as like slamming you in the face as younger whiskey. So New York Distilling Company was one of our very first partners. It was actually the first rye we ever put out. So this, and likewise, we haven't done much with them since our first 2 collections. So it was really fun for us to go back to them. They're an urban distillery in Brooklyn. They do some aging in upstate New York, but they were actually the first distillery that we pitched Lost Lantern as well, because we were still living in Brooklyn. And I think I saw them so I saw Tom Potter, one of the founders, at a whiskey festival. And I just walked up to him and said, "Hey, you don't know me, but let's work together." And he said,
Well, I think he did know you from when you were.
"Oh yeah, I think fine. It's less of a good story though, but whatever." He was probably the first person that said yes to us. But they initially focused on bars being a local go-to cocktail spirit in New York City. They have since really started working with heirloom grains and evolved into a distillery that really, really showcases a sense of place. I think this does slightly less than some of their newer stuff because it is from that more cocktail focused group of barrels. So to me, it's a little bit like you don't get as much of the grain forwardness as in the Spirit Works, which is why we felt comfortable doing both of these. I think it has a wonderful roundness to it that comes from making a spirit that is supposed to be multi-use, sipping cocktails. It also aged beautifully. I assume they didn't intend for it to get this old when they first made it, but it's really evolved into something special. You want to add something?
Yeah. Well, one of the things people have asked us about this a number of times is whether this is an Empire Rye, which is the designation that New York distillers created to showcase New York State rye. And the answer is that it is not, because this significantly predates the beginning of the Empire Rye classification, and that means it actually doesn't meet all the requirements for it, one of which is that Empire Ryes have to be more than 75% rye, and this is only 72% rye. So it's a reminder that, like, 10 years is a long time. Like, the craft distilling world was very different in 2014 than it is in 2024. Like, the whole world was very different in 2014 than it was in 2024. We did some posts about what we were all doing in 2014 when these barrels were first distilled, and I was like relatively early in my days as a whiskey journalist.
I was at Astor.
We were working at Astor.
Yeah.
Ryan, our production guy, was brewing, and I think that's one of the real pieces of romance about whiskey in general. It's a glimpse back into the past, whether that's 10 years or like if you're having like a scotch was made before you were born, then that's just there's something delightful about that to me.
And I do think
absolutely.
These two ryes are just so different, and it showcases both climate and also just what a range rye really has, like palate wise, what a breadth of flavors you can get from the same style of whiskey.
Absolutely. By the way, check out that post on Instagram, or those series of posts on Instagram about the 10-year difference. That was a lot of fun. So look up at Lost Lantern on Instagram.
At Lost Lantern Whiskey.
At Lost Lantern Whiskey. I apologize. Got to get that right. And that'll be, we'll put a link in the description as usual. So, this one, sometimes I have to check after I've poured this one. Is this a bourbon? Because to me, it comes across as floral and round. And those are the descriptors. At least you said round. I think that's kind of a common theme with this one. It has a roundness that actually reminds me of Maker's Mark. So I think there's something about that that's just pulling me in that direction. My favorite bourbon is Maker's Mark. I think it's hard for me to make an argument for anything else, really. And especially like the Maker's Mark 46 or the cask finishing series, cask strength stuff. So this definitely reminds me of those kinds of things. And I think that more than anything else is why I said this feels like a bourbon drinker's rye. There are still rye notes to this for sure. So I got, for example, floral I think comes up a lot more often in rye than it does in bourbon. And there's also an herbal character. And this actually, I think this reminds me a bit of Wilderness Trail Distilling rye. There's a similarity in character there as well, and I really like that one. Something about, I guess, as you said, 72% rye, something that's not too high rye and something that's not too low rye, like the barely legal rye, where this feels like rye that is really rye, not rye that's trying to be bourbon, and it's also not rye that's only rye, like it's just in your face. We decided to use 95% rye, so this is a nice balance for me. And out of the set, the non-American single malt part of this set, I think this one is my favorite.
Nice.
Same. And I also think that a lot of people that say that they don't like rye, it's because they've really only had that 95.5 rye. And that can be, it's like if someone tried peated Scotch and then says, I don't like any Scotch, which we know that a lot of people have done. But it's a similar thing where, if you get smacked over the head with something, you probably don't love it. But something like this, and we have a pumpernickel rye from Middle West that I love selling out of our tasting room, and it's just so accessible, and it totally changes what rye can be. And I like 95.5 rye, but I think it's more of an acquired taste, and there's an on-ramp to that. And this showcases what is there's a little bit more nuance and balance, and it's not just rye in your face. And I think the Spirit Works is more rye in your face. It's not 95.5, but having that balance even at 10 years is part of the reason that we did 2 ryes.
So I think I see where both of you are coming from on these being rye drinkers' ryes. The Spirit Works is a much more modern feeling rye, like the popular 95.5, and the New York Distilling is a much more old style Monongahela almost style rye. And I think that you are both correct, because there are a lot of different kinds of rye drinkers.
So true.
That is true.
My favorite rye is a 100% rye whiskey. And I've got to say the Spirit Works does have more of that flavor, but there is something in the deep, earthy, more herbal, less spice notes of the New York Distilling that I find really interesting.
You should be in a dispute resolution or mediation or something like that, because it was very compelling, and I accept that as both of us being right, which is ideal.
Yeah, but then Doug being on my side balances it out, so I'm still right.
I reject that logic.
Because Phil basically said he is not voting, or it's a vote for both. So it's either 3-2 or 2-1 still. So I still win. Just to be clear, just so we're all on the same page.
Yeah, no, it's a non-vote, right? So it's 2-1. Well, okay. Well, I guess that doesn't settle it.
Sounds like everyone is just gonna have to snag bottles for themselves. Actually, I think the New York Distilling Company one is also basically sold out.
Oh, it's still available at a couple of retailers. The Spirit Works we still have online, but
yeah. I don't think besides Massachusetts, once again, New York Distilling Company is sold out everywhere else. So everyone needs to move to Massachusetts, is what I'm saying.
Right. That's clearly the move. I mean, Boston, awesome, right? I visited Boston recently, and I went to the Trillium tasting room.
Nice.
And we're gonna be recording an episode with Trillium soon, because they're about to release an American single, or they've started distilling an American single malt. Saying they're about to release is way too premature. They tagged me in that. Happened to be about a week before I went to Boston, and then I was like, "Great, we should do an interview."
That's cool.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So that'll be fun. Given the holiday season, unclear when that interview will air, because I probably want to skip Christmas week
Fair.
And we've only got 2 more weeks to go. We've got a holiday special coming out. So, yeah, cool. Any further comments on this one, Phil? Anything you'd like to know?
Only that I wish I had picked up a bottle of that New York Distilling.
All right. Phil wishes he'd picked up a bottle of the New York Distilling. Now, that to me feels like a vote for the New York Distilling being the rye drinkers, right? I'm just saying.
No, not you too.
I mean, I can still theoretically get a bottle of the Spirit Works, right?
Yeah, that's still available on our, I think there's
It's on our site.
one bottle on our site.
Okay,
So-
my mistake. Phil was saying he wants both, but he regrets that he can't get this one. That's what he was saying.
Got
Not to put a vote in his mouth.
You always regret most the things that you don't do.
Mm-hmm. So true.
Well, all right. I guess let's move on to the last but not least, the Westland Distillery. Peated American single malt, 9.99 years old, 1 day short of 10 years old, if I understand correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Give or
And
take.
Doug, I know you've been waiting for this the whole
I
time.
have. This is I've been so Lost Lantern graciously sent me at least samples of these before launch day. Phil got them a little more recently.
Mhm.
So I was able to review this one essentially like more or less the day it went on sale. And I said, I will regret not buying a bottle of this. So I went and bought a bottle right away. Didn't even wait to fill up my cart. I was just like, we're doing a 1 bottle order because I can't take a chance.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of Westland. I think our audience probably won't know a ton about Westland because unfortunately we've never actually aired an interview with Westland. I had some equipment issues when I went for an in-person interview. And then the next interview that I recorded was actually meant to be part of our holiday special. So I just held it, and I've been holding it for a year. So there will be a holiday special coming out this season featuring Tyler Peterson. So we will finally have a Westland interview on record. But since our audience doesn't know a whole lot about Westland, please do give us a little information.
Yeah, so Westland is one of the first wave of American single malt distilleries, or at least the first modern wave. There are a few older ones like St. George and McCarthy's, but it's one of the first ones that started around in the wake of the financial crisis and wanted to create a whiskey that truly reflected their climate, which in this case is, of course, Pacific Northwest in Seattle. And I think that they've done a better job and have been more devoted to this than just about any other distillery, and have invested a tremendous amount in making a whiskey that truly reflects the Pacific Northwest. And what that means for them is that they work with locally grown barley. They work with the local agricultural university to help develop new strains of barley that grow even better in the Pacific Northwest. They have a custom, for many of their whiskeys, not for this one, they have a custom 5 malt recipe with different roast levels, which brings in some influence from Seattle's craft brewing scene. And of course, they're aging everything nowadays up in the Skagit Valley and have relatively natural, like open warehouses, which we've had the opportunity to go up to. And they also, of course, have through their new Westland Solemn series, which is, I think we're in edition 2 at this point, one of the first American whiskeys that was made with American peat. And this whiskey is not that. This is what Westland was doing much earlier on, and is made with Scottish peat because that was all you could get at that time. It took a tremendous amount of work to get to the point where an American malt company was making peated malt using American peat and have the specialized equipment that you need to do that without it also contaminating everything else they make with the peat smoke. And it was a long, long process. So early on, Westland sourced peated malt from elsewhere. Yep. Anything else you would add about the distillery?
No, but I would say for this whiskey, the interesting thing is, so it's heavily peated, but it's also new oak. So, and that is something that we generally don't gravitate towards fully new. We usually do some kind of use. I mean, our McCarthy stuff is second and third use, but for Westland, there's just something really special about the way that their whiskey takes new oak and peat and just makes it perfumey. And we picked this out like when it was 8 years old, 2 years ago, as part of a a number of barrels, 2 of which we've already released. But when we started thinking about our 10-year collection, we already had the Tom's Foolery here and we already had the Westland here. And so we started talking about if we could get at least 2, we needed a rye, then we could have a collection. But when we went to talk to the Westland team about doing a 10-year, they were very gracious about it and said, sure, like, oh, we haven't done one, but sure. We're not going to tell you, no, you can't do a 10-year whiskey. We would never say that. We feel very strongly that independent bottlers should be able to have creative license over it. But we just did, we felt like they should have that choice. And because we already had it in our inventory, we decided to dump it a day before it turned 10, because it's also something that Scotch independent bottlers do all the time, these weird things. And so releasing a 9.99 year whiskey would be whimsical and fun, and like also poke at the fact that like, does a day make a difference? Because technically this is a 9-year-old whiskey, not a 10-year-old whiskey. What difference does that make? And so all of that felt like the right thing to do, both when it comes to our long-term relationship with Westland, but also just our role as an independent bottler in the way that we're able to play with whiskey, which is different than a distillery might be able to.
The 10-year-old New York Distilling Company was actually bottled on its 10th birthday, which means the Westland was bottled in the relative life of those whiskeys the day before that. So like truly, what difference does that one day make except in the perception of it?
Except from a labeling perspective.
Oh, well, you had to do fun things to get that age statement.
Technically the age statement for the TTB is in days, because you either have to label it with days, months, or years. And in order for us to have it be 10 years minus 1 day, we had to do it in the full day age statement. They let me put 9.99 on the front, but on the back, you'll notice that the age statement on the bottom which is the official age statement, is the full number of days. Which is a fun thing that you only notice if you're looking for something like that.
I hadn't looked too closely at the bottle yet because I haven't done my... Yeah, there it is. Yeah, I haven't done my like full review with score of this one yet, where I would do a bottle picture and like scrutinize the label. But yep, one of 185 bottles, 3,649 days old. So that's 365 times 10 minus 1. I wonder how they accounted for leap days.
We chose to ignore leap days because it was more important for us to not be 10 years old.
Yeah.
So we figured it was technically 9.997 years old or something like that. So
yeah,
it rounds up in any case. Phil, do you want to do some tasting notes? Because I've already written some for this, so I don't want to spoil you.
This is beautifully sweet, floral, and smoky, and there's a note that kind of just a little bit reminds me of rosewater, but it's not really quite rosewater. Also, a note to the audience: if you ever spill rosewater or orange blossom water, good luck making that smell go away.
Yeah, I made my own grenadine recently, and I used the orange blossom water, and I was like, "Oh, this is dangerous. I've got to be really." I've like put paper towels everywhere. I was like, "I've got to be really careful not to get this on anything because it is pungent. You just need like 2 drops for an entire like." How much did I make? Like 8 ounces of grenadine.
Yeah.
It's also got this like nice, rich, meaty core to it. I really like this stuff.
Yeah. So I just want to make an observation. There is a certain type of American single malt whiskey fan that really dislikes New Oak and dislikes anything without a double-digit year on it. And I definitely had some private conversations with people in defense of, in defense of Westland and others before that do New Oak, right? It's not necessarily all bad. Look at Colorado, for example. That high elevation seems to make that New Oak almost not taste like New Oak at all. But then you have something that's just so like, it's 10 years old, yeah, and it's New Oak, yeah, but it's super soft. And every time some coincidence like this comes up, I sort of look to like, well, Westland is now owned by Remy, the same people who own Brook Laddie. And there's a lot of decisions, like they weren't owned by Bruichladdich when they distilled and barreled this. Sorry, by Remy. But there's such a commonality in philosophy between them that every time I see something like this and I'm like, oh, they thought, let's put a heavily peated whiskey in New Oak, right? And that has Octomore vibes for me. It's not nearly as peaty as Octomore, but there's something very, like, there's the same kind of DNA here philosophically.
And it's interesting because I think it's the first peated whiskey that we've ever released that we actually know the ppm for, because most distilleries in the US don't measure that. This is I think it's 55.
Yeah,
55 ppm. So pretty up there, not Octomore or Ardbeg Supernova levels, but definitely up there for like a normal whiskey.
which is why we call it heavily peated. Yeah, because we wouldn't usually say that, because we wouldn't know what the ppm is, and then it's all sensory, and that can be really misleading, but we actually know the ppm, so feel comfortable saying heavily peated. Yeah.
Cool. So that's in the same realm as say a Port Charlotte. So you could think of this as being like a Port Charlotte cask exploration series, New Oak, Virgin Oak, whatever it is that they're going to call it, just happens to be aged in the Pacific Northwest, which is a pretty similar climate to Scotland.
And I do think the only reason that they can get away with New Oak for this long with that level of peat is because they're in the Pacific Northwest. I can't imagine doing it in a warmer climate, because you would lose a lot. Like, it's still somehow, it's meaty, but there's a delicacy to it at the same time. And I just think that would be impossible at this age statement if it was in a different climate. It might still be delicious, but it wouldn't be the same kind of balance that Westland manages to get with this. I also wonder if the 2 years in Vermont has mellowed it a little bit, because we find that the beauty of being in Vermont, which is really cold a lot of the year, is that you don't get a lot of the oak extraction. You don't lose climate markers, but the whiskey does mellow a little bit. It will become a little bit more complex. It generally isn't as like in your face. And I do wonder if those 2 years here could have had an impact that way, where it let it integrate without pulling more of the kind of oak tannin out of the barrel. But we'll never know, because even if there's a Westland barrel that's exactly the same in Seattle, we all know that it could have started tasting wildly different years ago. So,
But it is interesting compared to the Thomas Foolery, where with that we all quickly jumped to like, how is this different than 10-year-old Kentucky bourbon, which is something that is pretty readily familiar to most whiskey drinkers in some way. But like, there really isn't much to compare a 10-year-old American single malt to. There are only a handful of them in the first place. And American single malt, as you two know better than just about anybody else, can be very, very, very different from Scotch. It is not a direct comparison to Scotch or to other single malts around the world. So like, what is the general flavor of a 10-year-old American single malt? I just don't think we know yet, and probably won't know for another 10 years.
Yep. And the examples that exist are extremely regionally distributed, to say the least, right? You've got Westland has age statements that are getting up there, at least close to that 10-year mark. You have the Notch, which is, as far as I know, the oldest age statement available commercially. They've got 18. Totally. Do they have a 21, or is it just they go up to 18?
They also have a 12 and a 15 year.
Yes, they also have a 12 and a 15, but they go all the way up to 18. They don't release anything under 2 digits, which is it's kind of a cool it's a cool core conceit for a distillery. They are incredibly expensive, though. I feel I have to mention that because one of the components of my reviews, for anyone who's familiar with my written reviews, is I write a score for taste, not including packaging or price or anything like that, because I would like to be able to rate things when I know what it is exactly the same as I would rate it when it's blind. And I want to try to be as consistent as possible with that. I think that gives people the best idea of what they're going to be drinking. But then I also like to include a value score, which is extremely subjective. That's where I throw all of my subjective opinions, right? What's the packaging like? What's the price for value ratio? How unique is this on my shelf? And all sorts of factors like that. How strongly would I recommend? And I usually frame it as, would I buy a bottle or would I buy another bottle? And how likely would I be to do that? So score from 1 to 5. Usually I avoid talking about value, especially when we're doing an interview live, because I think that value is that extremely subjective, right? Like, I don't know what your budget is. There are people who have higher budgets than I do for whiskey, certainly, right? Or at least people who prefer to spend lots more money on a single bottle than I do, right? I'm like, sure, 350 bottles, let's go, right? But they're all like under $120 for the most part. So that's not everybody's. And then there are people who are, I'm not going to spend more than $30 on a bottle of whiskey. And frankly, this podcast is probably not for those people because American single malt really doesn't come in under $45. Most of them are 60 and above. So, and then Lost Lantern is, usually much higher than that. So, and I should qualify much higher as being circa $100 a bottle, right? Like it's not crazy. So and then there's the Notch. That's Nantucket, right? That's in the Northeast on an island, very different climate from say Stranahan's, which has a 10-year, and I think an 11-year now. So they're getting into double-digit age statements, and I can't think of any others, to be honest, off the top of my head. Do you know any?
With a 10-year age statement? I think Great Lakes Distilling in Wisconsin did one, but and I know Finger Lakes Distilling has done some 10 to 12-year-old single barrel, single malts, but only in their tasting room. So I think that part of the reason that with whiskeys like this, like as you were saying, if we're talking about value, like these are these 4 whiskeys are 4 of the 5 most expensive whiskeys we ever released. They're all $150, and that's probably because even those distilleries that we're working with among this group that are kind of big now, 10 years ago they weren't, and they have sold most of that whiskey many years before. So there's very little of it left, and it costs money to age whiskey for that long, both in real money and opportunity cost too.
Yeah. So it was more expensive to us.
Yeah.
So it's more expensive to people who want to stack a bottle.
Yeah. I think there are a handful of distilleries that have 3 or 4 10-year-old barrels squirreled away, or maybe have done one single cask in honor of a big anniversary or something like that. But very few that have really built it into being a major part of their program in the way that 888 and Stranahan's have done.
Yeah.
There will be more though, eventually.
Yeah. Asterisk. 888 is the Notch. We're talking about the same. Yeah. No, I mean, because it is the distillery is called 888. The product is called the Notch, and I didn't call that out. So I just wanted to make sure that the audience is not confused. So I don't remember if I did tasting notes on this one yet, verbally. Mm-hmm. So sort of what I got was, as you said, there's that sort of savory, meaty core, but it's not like barbecue, like usually like a heavily peated whiskey, especially one that's like somehow aged in a sherry cask. You take heavy peated whiskey, you age it in a sherry cask. Somehow that becomes barbecue. This is new oak, and maybe that's the reason, but there's something a little bit different at this. It's like candied bacon, but not quite. It's like a sweet country ham without the ham flavor, if that makes sense. And that's sort of the core of the palate. But what I get on the nose and sort of the beginning of the palate is like marzipan, apricot, and like it's like a bright kind of smoke, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But it's like it's pretty gentle. I think in 10 years that heavily peated smoke, right? I think people get scared of heavily peated, like you said, right? You think Ardbeg, low age statement. I mean, not that 10 years the standard Ardbeg is a low age statement, but for Scotland it's a fairly low age statement. Like, and then everything else from Ardbeg is no age statement, so probably younger, maybe not. So people think young age statement Islay Scotch, and that's one of my favorite styles. Like full disclosure, I love that intense medicinal peaty smoke, but I also appreciate that extra age brings that smoke down and turns it into something else. You get some more esters, some more floral qualities come out. That smoke level sort of comes down. It becomes more approachable as peated whiskey gets older. It gets closer to unpeated whiskey in a sense, but it also develops these flavors you can only get from starting with a peated base. And I think this Westland is doing some of the best of that. It's started heavily peaty. You can kind of tell that DNA is there, but it's come down. You can still tell it's peaty. It's 100% peated malt, as opposed to something like, for people who are afraid of peat, Boulder Spirits usually does a mix of unpeated and peated malt. And I think that comes across as just a tiny hint earthy and just a wisp of smoke. And I think that works really well for a lot of people. But this heavily peated and give it some time and bring that smoke down, this really works for me. Not that the Boulder doesn't. I really like the Boulder stuff too. And I actually bring that out for tastings all the time because people who've never tried peated whiskey before, I'm afraid of throwing Ardbeg at them, right?
Yeah.
I love having something on my shelf that's just a touch peaty, whether it's a really old, heavily peated, really quote, really old, really heavily peated, or whether it's something that's a mix of mostly unpeated and just a little bit of peated. Both of those things are great ways to introduce people to peat. So if you're afraid of peat, but you want to give it a try, I can recommend this. It's really good. One taste and I ordered a $150 bottle, no questions asked. So that's my endorsement.
I would like to briefly be the unwelcome voice of reason. How is it looking outside for you guys?
It's fine.
Dark. And it mostly stopped actually, so I think we're okay.
We're good. It's like maybe 2 inches. We can drive in that very easily.
Okay.
So thank you.
I recently had a much worse experience driving through the mountains of Idaho in a snowstorm like 3 weeks ago, and that was got good weather for most of the trip until the very last day, and then had to navigate my way through a narrow, winding canyon for 3 hours
Without
downhill
snow tires.
without snow tires in a rental car, and I was like, I'm not going to die, but I might end up in the river, and that's not going to be fun. I'm not going to be good for my car insurance.
That's when you wish that I was there, because I grew up in Vermont, so I have a lot of experience driving in snow. So usually, if it starts snowing, we will do a switcheroo if we need to. So.
That reminds me, it's getting to the season where I need to put my snow chains in my trunk before I regret it.
My favorite thing about talking to people who grew up in the Northeast and, you know, the very northern part of like Minnesota and Wisconsin and whatnot is them joking about, oh yeah, I learned how to drive in 6 inches of snow on bald tires. And like, you see 3 flakes of snow and people forget how to drive here.
Yeah. It took a little bit to get, because we were in New York City for so long, not driving. It took a little bit of getting used to again, but we're good.
Yeah, we're pros now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is learning how to drive again after living in New York kind of like riding a bike, or is it a totally different thing?
It took me a while longer to get my sea legs under me again with like driving in extremely busy cities, because like in New York you just take taxis everywhere or take the subway.
Luckily Vermont, there's like not very many humans, so you have to be more worried about the deer than usually about other drivers. So
do you get meese up there?
Meese.
Yes, but I have never seen one.
They exist, but they're just in so much. This is another TED talk, but they're in so much trouble from ticks and the like that you don't really see them that much anymore.
But we do regularly hear coyotes howling outside our window at night, so that's kind of cool, and good reason to not have like little pets.
Yes, that's true.
No outdoor rabbits for our.
You're going to say no outdoor rats.
Yeah, that's what I thought he was saying.
Indoor rats.
I was like, all right, we do not have indoor rats either. Just to be clear.
So my dog is very small. She's like 15 to 20 pounds, depending on the season. And she also sometimes, depending on her haircut, kind of looks like a bunny. And so we worry sometimes about there's coyotes that come through the neighborhood. Last night I was walking the dog and there were owls everywhere. I've never heard owls in our neighborhood before, but there were owls hooting in the trees everywhere around me. And I'm like, I wonder how worried I should be about an owl swooping down and trying to get the dog. Like, I don't know exactly how small of animals they go for.
That would be a ballsy owl.
I think you should be more than zero worried about it, but not infinitely worried about it.
More than 0 and less than 10% worried is that?
Roughly. More than 0, less than epsilon. That's a math joke for you.
Yeah.
I will say there is I think it's got to be a massive barred owl, about probably close to an 8-foot wingspan that lives near me and sits on the overhead power lines and watches very closely as I walk my mom's dog, and she's 70 pounds. So You never know what an owl is thinking.
It's true.
That's very true.
They look so cute and cuddly, but they are vicious apex predators. Apex-ish.
I mean, you won't hear them coming.
So, Doug, is it fair to say that Westland is your favorite of these? I mean, this is a single malt podcast after all.
Yeah, I mean, so Phil has been my dutiful producer, and reluctantly comes along with essentially at this point only drinking American single malt due to his availability on this show. I'm glad that he occasionally gets to have some rye when we've got a producer on that does something other than American single malt. Like we also had Liberty Pole on recently.
Nice.
To talk about. They had a single barrel American single malt coming out, but mostly they had rye available outside of the state. So we were able to order some rye and talk about that. So I like throwing Phil a bone every once in a while with the rye, but there's a reason that I made the American Single Malt podcast to sort of follow on the Single Malt Matters podcast after it discontinued. And that's because I pretty much only drink American single malt and I'm happy with that. Right. And I would say it's like 70-80% American single malt and like 20% scotch and a tiny sliver of bourbon is my drinking habit. So it only took me 4 years of American single malt before I started drinking beer again. So it's kind of beer season now. I'm drinking a little bit of beer recently.
Nice.
But yeah, I all that qualification out of the way. Yeah, like of course the American single malt is my favorite. But I do have to say that I've discovered some really brilliant rye and bourbon here. And there's definitely a world in which I would have bought the full set, but the budget wasn't quite there at the time these went on sale, so I didn't. I had to just make the quick choice and buy the Westland. I'm more than happy with that personally. But if I had bought either of those ryes, I would be happy with it. Absolutely.
Yeah. We've been very pleased by the reception to the collection, both the whiskeys themselves and the message, because I think a lot of people still do think that everything that's out there is 5 or 6 years old, even if at best. And this is a jump up from that. And it's exciting for us. I wish we could have done more American single malts in the collection, but a lot of places just don't have one. Like I would love to do a 10-year McCarthy's. That just has to exist first. But one of these days.
Caitlin, if you're listening.
We do have in the back of our minds that, like, if you do the math, they probably do have at least one barrel that's made it that old. The question is, when can that be commercialized? So we'll see. We'll see. Bated breath. I mean, I will jump. I don't care what it costs. I will jump all over a 10-year-old McCarthy's.
Yeah.
That'll be my splurge purchase for sure.
I've got 2 kidneys.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, did you say you had 2 questions?
I was just saying, I've got 2 kidneys. I can make do with one. If
2 kidneys.
Luckily, McCarthy's doesn't usually go kidney level expensive. They'll probably put a 10-year-old out and it'll somehow be like shockingly affordable, but then we won't be able to get as much as we want.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing about McCarthy's. It's always bonkers to me. It is always shockingly affordable for what it is.
Yeah.
Agree.
Definitely one of our favorite American single malt distilleries. And as you know, we've worked with them several times.
Yep. And as have I, my first ever, and I say and I feel like that's in the retail sense of because it really was a huge team effort. Phil was hugely involved in it. Caitlin pulled so much weight for us, of course. And then the other people in the whiskey lodge, right? This was a team effort, but our first single barrel, and the only one on the horizon, because we haven't made any plans for another one, was the McCarthy's.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. That's a great first one to do. It's very impressive. We have a bottle. I should have put it on the back bar, but I didn't remember to bring it from home.
Someone bought a bottle of that. So
yeah.
Someone. Well, hey, I'll put it up on screen again. It's great to know that you got it and you enjoyed it. So there's our single barrel. You can still get it. Link in the description.
I will be totally honest. The highest compliment that we have received is that other producers have picked up bottles of our single barrel and told us that they really appreciate it, and that means a lot to us.
Yeah, I won't say it was the plan for us to release an excellent single barrel and then say, "Hey, look, we know what we're doing," but it certainly was a nice outcome. Okay, so looking at the whole 10-year collection, are we going to do the thing? Let's do the thing.
Oh, I was just going to really quick because
Yeah,
I've
go
got
for
it
it.
behind me and I can. Poured a little bit of the Middle West rye to compare to these two,
Okay.
Nice.
and it's amazing how like different all three are.
Mhm.
I've got to say, I do appreciate that what that 10 years does to the rye whiskey because it just completely changes the aspect. I was going to say aspect ratio, but like changes the way you're looking at
Mhm.
the grain in the whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's
But
the
yeah,
thing? We're gonna do the thing. What does that mean? I'm scared.
Oh, okay. So you might be you might have a good reason to be scared. We sort of we used to always say, "Hey, which of the things that we poured is our favorite?" And when we're talking about, especially when we're talking about different distilleries or different blenders or whatever, we're worried, hey, maybe that is going to hurt some feelings. So another thing we can do instead is to blend everything that we've poured together into a single glass
God,
and then do tasting notes on that.
that is going to be probably not good.
Probably it's sometimes it turns out pretty well. Most of the time it's just okay. We haven't had anything awful yet, so
it's
that's
true.
nice. But yeah,
Well,
I'm up for doing that if you are.
it's the first time for everything.
But I already finished
Yeah.
my Westland.
That's fine. You've got a little end of your glass.
Yeah, I've got just a tiny bit of Westland left, and I
It's
wondered if I
probably
should
that's
Well-
probably a good thing.
add a
Well,
little
here's the
more for
thing.
flavor. But before we do that, I just want to say I just went back through all the glasses. One thing that tends to happen for me is once I've had single malt, if I taste anything that has been, let's say, single malt that wasn't aged in a new oak cask, once I've had that, if I taste anything that's like a bourbon or a rye, especially a very oaky one, it just tastes over oaked to me, regardless of its own merits. It's just that contrast usually works badly for bourbon and rye.
Mhm.
In this case, I mean, maybe it's because the Westland is a new oak cask, but all of them still taste excellent. They're all, frankly, phenomenal whiskey, well worth the $150 price point. I'm sure some of those are better values than others. I think there was probably a marketing reason to have them all be $150.
I
So if
mean,
you
I think
feel
that's
like
also down to the drinker too.
it, of
Just
course, yes, of course. So if you feel like you know, wow, words. If you feel like telling us a little bit more about maybe how you chose the price points at this time, or feel free to pass on that question.
Well, we can say why we put them all at the same price because we didn't want to. Just as you are right that sometimes I don't want to say like on the record which one of them is my favorite because we of course love all of them and we do. We have to agree on everything that we pick. You can also send that message with pricing too.
Yeah.
And we often find that it is not our cheapest whiskey in the collection that sells the fastest. It's the most expensive one because people think, well, if that's the most expensive, that must be $40 better than the other one. So for these, we wanted to say like, these are all really special and unique whiskeys. And it's not like the Westland. If the Westland had been 180 and the others were 150, that sends a different message. That like that one is better or different in some way.
Yeah.
All right, so I am
for non-answer. Yeah.
On the
I am
note of
concocting my
coming
blend
back-
right now.
Yeah.
on the
So
note of
one
coming
thing we
Wait,
learned as
Phil was trying to
blenders.
ask-
Sorry,
Sorry.
Phil's trying to talk. My mistake. Phil, go ahead.
It's all right. On the note of coming back to the other whiskeys after the peated Westland, the Tom's Foolery has a really strong cedar note to me coming back from the Westland, and I find that really interesting. And I think it's just different sort of oak profile.
Mm-hmm. What were you going
makes
to
sense
say?
to me. Well, I was going to say one thing we have learned as blenders over the last few years, and these were all single casks, so we weren't really talking about blending, is that the order in which you blend the components matters a great deal. So, Doug, I'm curious, do you remember what order you just combined the whiskeys in?
Yes, I started with the Tom's Foolery. I added the Spirit Works and then the New York and then the Westland.
Okay, cool.
Just went down the line
went
and
down
put them in the first
sequentially.
glass. So that's interesting. I would not have thought that, especially considering that we're giving it 0 time to integrate, right? This is the worst possible showing for a blend right now.
Yep. It truly is. When we blend, we let things sit for a couple of days before we even do sensory analysis. But especially now, the last thing that you poured in will be the dominant thing, even if it hadn't been the Westland.
Okay.
And even more so before it integrates, right?
Yeah. That's my point.
Yeah. I don't even hope you'll be able to taste the Westland since I think we got like 1 drop of
Good.
it in there.
Might not be awful then.
I added a little bit more because I felt like the 2 drops against
I mean,
an eighth of an ounce of the others wasn't really fair.
and High West Campfire is great, and that's
true. That's a fair point. I don't think they disclose the ratios, though, do they?
I don't know.
I will say the very perfumey smoke off of the Westland actually plays very nicely with the sort of more like herbal oakiness of the ryes and the real sharpness of the Spirit Works kind of gets cut back a little bit. Or not sharpness, brightness, like peppery notes.
There's
I don't know
like
if
a
it's-
shortbread note that came out.
I get like
I don't know if
violets.
this is the best way to drink these. In fact, I'm pretty sure it isn't.
No,
No.
it never will be. And it,
No.
brilliantly picked single casks. There's no way we could blend them. And if they were better as a blend, we know that our blending team here at Lost Lantern would have made
Right.
it so.
Yeah. Well, we find that single casks do not generally play well with others. The barrels that we buy for blending are quite distinct from the single cask worthy barrels. So, yeah, I would be very surprised if this wasn't all elbows and knees. So,
I mean, it's not better than the sum of its parts, but it's not angry.
no, it's
Like,
not bad. It's not as because, well, especially for us where you did so little Westland to feel like that's the noisy uncle of the bunch when it comes to the blend.
The nose is a little noisy, and mostly is driven by the smoke from the Westland. But you do get nice hints of the sort of like toffee caramel stuff you'd expect from bourbon and rye, and that floral perfumed kind of. I mean, the floral I think is coming from the Spirit Works, and that sort of perfume smoke from Westland. Those go nice together, and the palate is actually like pretty nicely balanced, I think.
Have you ever had the Johnny Walker High Rye blend?
Nope.
I have at
This
some
makes me
point.
think of that. Like if you take away that like classic Johnny Walker, like because all the Johnny Walkers taste the same, like they've got that same core. If we take that away, this tastes like everything around it in the Johnny Walker High Rye.
I like it. I have
Yeah,
no idea what
I'll
you're
take it.
talking about, but I like it.
I know what he's talking about, and I'll take it.
I think that Johnny Walker High Rye showed up at one of those the Whiskeys of the World showcases, which Lost Lantern has been at almost every year, at least every year that I've been there, which has been 3 or 4 times now. And by the way, while I was there, I believe I'm wearing it. I got the Lost Lantern pin
Oh,
from
nice.
Nora. Let me zoom
Yes.
in. So I also got to help hand out those pins because Nora was there solo and a little bit overwhelmed.
Yes.
Did,
It happens.
Did you help her out when it got
There's
swamped?
always one point in the night when you're solo at a festival.
You were the last table to close down, I think, and so there was a line out the door trying to get. I wonder if it was just like, hey, let's get our last whiskey, but I think that everyone was hearing. I mean, like people were coming from across the show to come see the Lost Lantern table because they heard really good things about what they had.
As they should.
Yeah, I think Lost Lantern was easily in the top 3 best booths at the show this year out of 20 or 30.
Awesome. That's nice to hear. Because I never get to see it. You never get. If it's 2 of us, we'll sneak out and check out what everyone else is pouring. But when it's just me or just you, it's you can't even go to the bathroom. There are no breaks. You're there. So.
Although last year someone brought me a plate of cookies towards the end, and I was like, "Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that."
That's someone that's hoping that you'll leave a bottle at the table
right.
by accident at the end of the night.
Yeah.
Which you don't do.
So you poured the Westland at
the Westland was a big hit because there was a Westland table, and so people wanted to taste both. So yeah,
that's fine. I really like.
No, I personally didn't manage to make it to the Westland table, and I rationalized that as like, there's so much stuff here that I don't get to try, and Westland is local, and I can go there anytime I want.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes.
Yeah. As I've said before, I feel bad that I think I take Westland for granted, and I wonder if they think I'm not that big of a fan of them because, a year and 2 months into this podcast and we still haven't had an interview released, and it's like, well, why? Well, it's because I'm not that organized. That's the whole reason. That's the entire reason.
I get that, and we sometimes get people asking us like, when are you going to do a single cask from somewhere in New England? The only New England distillery we've worked with is 888, which was in our American Battered Malt. But beyond that, it's partly just because we haven't visited that many, because I'm spending most of my time visiting distilleries in like North Dakota and Idaho or Montana or the Pacific Northwest or California or places that are hard to get to. And I'm like, I can go to visit distilleries in Connecticut like Thursday.
So you never do.
So I never do.
Yeah, it happens to everyone. Okay, so since we're talking about the 10-year collection, just sort of one last, I guess, sort of philosophical discussion to take us out. This is the oldest whiskey from Lost Lantern, and as you've mentioned, this is the oldest whiskey from 2 of these distilleries. In your opinion, are we seeing a trend towards older age statements? And if so, is that because of changing palates? Or is that because maybe these distilleries want to aim a little older? Or is there some other reason, perhaps?
I think it's because a lot of them want to aim a little older and are now mature enough as distilleries and as companies that they can do that. Like many of them increased their scale a certain number of years ago and are starting to see the results of that, whether it's with a 10-year-old whiskey or like even when we started in 2020 and 2021, I think our average age statement was probably 3.
You think 3?
I think it was 3. Where we often, because a lot of things we did were from Texas. And now it's, if we exclude things from Arizona, which are like 1-year-old, our average age statement is closer to 5 or 6. And we've had more things above that. And I think, I don't know, haven't talked about it, but I think the next time we release a 10-year-old whiskey, we won't necessarily make a huge fanfare about it. We'll just say, here's a great 10-year whiskey from wherever it happens to be from.
Yeah. It's notable to me in especially in the sourcing world that our age statements are now older than a lot of the NDPs that are sourcing MVP. And that's a really interesting changing of the guard where age is not something that is necessarily like craft versus a bigger distillery. It's a choice.
Awesome.
I mean, that sort of, ties back into the, the discussion of, are the higher age statements really needed? And the thing to remember there, I think, is that when you're buying Kentucky bourbon, a lot of it isn't as old as you think it is. A lot of it is in the 4 to 6 year age range. And I think a lot of people who look at craft distilleries and go, oh, they're releasing stuff that's too young, when they're releasing stuff at 3 or 4 years old, are missing that. And I think that that's just an unfortunate fact of life that, educating the public on is going to be always an uphill battle.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Scotch fans love their high age statements. American whiskey fans mostly don't know their age statements.
Yeah. And Scotch age statements are going up, and that's for a different reason. And that's straight up because Scotch sales are down. So they've also increased production. So there's more whiskey. And I think we'll see a little of that with some of the big, not necessarily big traditional producers, but big newer producers in Kentucky and Tennessee. So I think those NDP age statements will start to come up relatively soon. But it'll be interesting to see if prices go up with them or if they come down too.
Yeah.
The price to age comparison is a very complicated one, in that you can get a 10-year-old Scotch is relatively affordable. A 10-year-old or 15-year-old American single malt isn't necessarily, because there isn't much of it. And if you're talking a 15 or 20-year-old bourbon, then forget it.
And I probably don't want to drink it anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no notes of splinters.
Mm.
I get sawdust and just dust.
For the bad ones, certainly can be true. There's obviously amazing.
They're
bourbon too, but-
yeah, they're select few, but warmer climates, 15 to 20 years, you're probably getting a dozen bottles. So.
Yeah.
All right, Phil, I have a question for you. You may have already finished your glass, but I've got maybe, I don't know, a quarter ounce left. And I'm wondering if I should stick this in a sample bottle and actually do a review of our little blend here, instead of just like walking off with it, because I won't be able to drink it right now. I'll have to wait until at least tonight. What do you think? Should we do a review later?
Sure.
All right, I will save that.
Really interesting. I apologize in advance to our esteemed and beloved guests. Making a mockery of your hard work.
We don't take ourselves very seriously, so
it's done with love, and we will definitely make sure to say that this is just a Franken whiskey. That there's a subreddit for that, by the way. It's called Franken whiskey. This is just a Franken whiskey we made, and in no way reflects on Lost Lantern. That we did it because we love it. So yeah, I think that'll be fun. It's always fun to do these. So last year when I did my American Single Malt Advent, the way that I was pouring things, I had to go quick because I was like 4 hours away from taking a flight to Texas. And I'm like, I'm just going to take samples with me. I'm going to throw them in my luggage in these, which are great for 4 sample bottles with like just 1 layer of bubble wrap. So I was using a Glencairn. Right. I was like, I just pulled out all my Glencairns. So like they're clean and dry and they don't smell like anything. So I'm going to use the Glencairn and I'm going to pour what looks like 2 ounces. And then I'm going to pour the 2 ounces into the bottle. And then, oh, there's some left. So cool. We're going to make a blend. Right. And so I kept on going through that. And I was like, new Glencairn looks like 2 ounces, pour it in the bottle. There's a little bit left, put it in the Glencairn. And so I ended up with 2 separate blends of, and there was some intelligence behind how I did those blends. And because this past year was so busy, I never got around to reviewing those. So it's basically full 2 ounce sample bottles. At some point, I will review those and go like, hey, it's Revenge of American Single Malt Advent 2023. This is what I drank. But now it's all in one. So speaking of which, American Single Malt Advent 2024 is on, despite the fact that I've been too busy to actually post reviews. So I'm doing my best. I'm posting what I can. I do hope before and including the 31st that I will actually do 23 or 24 reviews of American Single Malt whiskey before the end of the year. There's still time. I can make it work. Fingers crossed. But everybody else, please contribute your reviews. You don't have to participate in day 1 through day 24. It's just cool to get everybody out reviewing American Single Malt whiskey or just talking about American Single Malt whiskey in December, because it is Advent, and even if you're not Christian, Advent is as good an excuse as any to say, hey, we're still waiting on the TTB to ratify American Single Malt whiskey, and this is important to us. We think it should be important to you as well, because whether you're a fan of American Single Malt whiskey or not, I'm soapboxing. Let me make my face bigger. Whether you're a fan of American Single Malt or not, I think you can appreciate that avoiding confusion in labeling is important. And as long as we don't have a formal definition for American Single Malt whiskey, there's a potential that things will come out that don't necessarily conform with that definition. And the more popularity that American Single Malt whiskey accumulates, the more you'll have people saying, hey, we can do whatever we want and call it American Single Malt whiskey, because there actually isn't a regulation. We want to get that fixed as soon as possible. So what you should do is there's a link to a campaign from Spirits United, I believe, to write to the TTB to tell them, hey, please speed this along. We want this regulation to exist. And the other thing you should do is you should go to whatever distillery is closest to you or that is your favorite that makes American single malt, and you should buy a postcard from them or something along those lines. And then you should mail that postcard with a statement that says you support the definition of American single malt whiskey and you'd like your legislature to do that. Mail that to your senator and put some pressure on them, because it's easy enough to ignore a petition and emails and a big online form. It's less easy to ignore when hundreds of postcards are coming in physical snail mail. And maybe the secretaries will actually notice, hey, people are writing in about this issue. We should pay attention to that. So make them pay attention. That is my call out to you. That is your challenge. More than writing reviews of American single malt and posting about your favorite bottles and whatever, this American single malt Advent 2024, we want you to write in support of American single malt whiskey. That's what we want you to do. So please join us in that. Thank you very much. I'll put a link in the description to a blog post that talks about how we want you to do that. I should have written that blog post a long time ago, but we'll call that my post of the day. I will write that blog post. So that is my American single malt whiskey post of today. And great. So anything else?
I think that's it for us. But yeah, if you're interested in learning more about any of these, just check us out at Lost Lantern Whiskey on Instagram, or sign up for our newsletter on our website. Our next release,
LostLanternWhiskey.com. Yeah.
And our next release will be our spring 2025 collection, coming, believe it or not, in spring 2025.
Fantastic. And thank you for giving how people can get in touch with you. I will put that in the description as always. And there's only one last thing to do, which is, as we make our way out here, we need a toast. And I think toast to the forward progress of quality. It doesn't have to be older, but it is getting better.
Cheers.
Cheers to that.
So, cheers.
Gotcha.
Thanks, Nora and Adam, for joining us once again. It's lovely to have you as always, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank
Thanks
you
To
for
very
everyone
having
much.
else, let's see. Did I actually bring my? To everyone else, hey, look, I've got the Whiskey Lodge Glencairn, which you can also get. Link in the description. To everyone else, cheers, and until next time, we'll see you in the lodge. Good night, everybody.
Good night.